"This area is for members only, ma'am," my daughter-in-law said loud enough for half the ballroom to hear. A few people turned toward me immediately. I recognized that look. The polite kind of curiosity wealthy people use when they think someone doesn't belong. I stood there quietly beneath the gold chandeliers of Westbridge Country Club with my cream-colored gloves folded neatly in my hands, while Vanessa Whitmore smiled at me like she'd finally won something she'd been chasing for years. My son Daniel stood beside her in a charcoal gray tuxedo, staring somewhere over my shoulder instead of at me. That hurt more than her words did. "I'm glad to have you here. Stay with me until the end and let me know where you're watching from, because I never imagined a single sentence at a country club would completely change the way I saw my own family." The ballroom smelled faintly of roses and expensive perfume. Crystal glasses clinked softly beneath the music of a piano playing somewhere near the back terrace. Everything looked elegant, controlled, perfect. Vanessa fit into that world naturally with her diamond earrings and smooth blonde hair, and the effortless confidence of someone who had spent her whole life believing beautiful places belonged to people like her. I adjusted the sleeve of my navy dress slowly, pretending not to notice the way she looked me up and down. I had spent nearly 2 hours getting ready for that dinner. I even wore the pearl earrings my late husband Thomas bought me during our anniversary trip to Boston 20 years ago. Daniel used to love those earrings when he was little. He once told me they made me look like a movie star. Funny how children grow up and forget the women who raised them. "Vanessa," Daniel muttered quietly, finally shifting beside her. But it wasn't a defense. It was the nervous voice of a man trying to avoid discomfort. Vanessa gave a tiny laugh and touched his arm gently. "I'm just trying to avoid confusion, honey. Members have private reservations tonight." Honey. She always used that voice when she wanted to sound sweet in front of strangers. I looked past them toward the ballroom staircase where guests in tuxedos and evening gowns moved beneath the warm golden lights. 20 years ago, Thomas and I had walked through those same doors together during a winter charity gala. Back then, people greeted us differently. Back then, my son still looked proud to stand beside me. "I received Daniel's invitation yesterday," I said calmly. My voice sounded smaller than I expected. Vanessa tilted her head slightly. "Oh? That's strange. This event is extremely exclusive." There it was. Not anger. Not cruelty. Worse. Embarrassment. She was embarrassed of me. Of my age. My quietness. My old-fashioned gloves and department store dress standing in the middle of her polished world. A young couple near the staircase glanced toward us before quickly looking away again. Daniel loosened his jaw like he wanted to say something, but the silence stretched too long. Then I noticed the security guard near the entrance watching us carefully. He was older, maybe late 60s, with silver hair and broad shoulders beneath a black uniform jacket. He looked at me for several long seconds. Not confused. Not suspicious. Just thoughtful. Vanessa noticed him too and straightened immediately. "Sir," she called with a tight smile, gesturing lightly toward me. "There seems to be a misunderstanding." The guard began walking toward us slowly. His polished shoes echoed softly across the marble floor. And suddenly, for the first time that evening, Vanessa stopped smiling. The security guard stopped a few feet away from us and looked directly at me. Not at Vanessa. Not at Daniel. Me. His expression softened almost immediately, and for a moment I saw recognition flicker across his face like an old memory returning. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said politely, placing one hand behind his back. "We have been expecting you upstairs." The silence that followed felt strange and heavy. Vanessa blinked twice, her confident posture tightening almost instantly. "I think there has been some confusion," she said carefully, forcing a laugh that sounded thinner now. "My mother-in-law is not a member here." The guard turned toward her slowly. "Mrs. Whitmore has been a member longer than most people in this building, ma'am." I noticed the exact second. The color drained from her face. Small things reveal people. A twitch near the eye. Fingers tightening around a champagne glass. The sudden stiffness in a smile that no longer feels safe. Daniel looked between us in confusion. "Mom?" he asked quietly, like he had just realized there were entire parts of my life he had never bothered to understand. I folded my gloves carefully before answering. "Your father and I joined Westbridge before you started elementary school." My voice remained calm, But inside me something had shifted. Not anger. Not satisfaction. Just clarity. The kind that comes when you finally stop making excuses for people you love. Vanessa recovered quickly. I will give her that. Women like her survive by recovering quickly. Well, she said with a brittle smile, touching Daniel's arm again, I just did not want any awkward misunderstandings tonight. Awkward misunderstandings. Such elegant words for humiliation. The guard stepped aside respectfully and gestured toward the staircase leading to the upper ballroom. Mrs. Hale is waiting for you upstairs, Mrs. Whitmore. That name caught Daniel off guard immediately. Margaret Hale? He asked. The chairwoman? The guard nodded once. Daniel looked at me differently then. Not warmly. Not lovingly. More like a man trying to solve a puzzle he suddenly realized had been sitting in front of him his entire life. I began walking toward the staircase slowly, my heels pressing softly against the marble floor. The pianist continued playing as though nothing had happened. Around us, conversations resumed in hushed tones. But I could still feel eyes following me through the ballroom. Vanessa stayed frozen for half a second before hurrying beside Daniel. I could hear the tension in her breathing now. Why did you never mention this? Daniel asked quietly as we climbed the stairs. I almost smiled at that question. Children rarely ask who their parents were before they became parents. To them, you simply appear one day already old, already tired, already existing only in relation to their lives. They do not imagine you once built things, sacrificed things, belonged somewhere. You never asked, I said softly. Upstairs, the ballroom overlooked the entire golf course through towering windows framed by dark velvet curtains. Candlelight reflected against crystal chandeliers, casting warm gold across the room. Men in tailored suits stood beside women wearing gowns that probably cost more than my first car. And yet none of it intimidated me. It never had. Because long before Vanessa learned how to hold a champagne flute properly, I had spent years walking these halls beside my husband, while helping organize scholarship galas and fundraising dinners that kept this club alive during difficult years. Near the far end of the ballroom, a silver-haired woman turned toward us. Margaret Hale. Even at 73, she carried herself with the effortless grace of someone born into old money. The moment she saw me, her entire face lit up. Eleanor, she said warmly, opening her arms. There you are. We were beginning to think you had abandoned us. And standing beside my son while the most powerful woman in the club embraced me like family, I finally saw the fear settling quietly behind Vanessa's eyes. Margaret Hale kept one hand wrapped warmly around mine as she guided me farther into the ballroom. You disappeared from us after Thomas passed, she said softly. Half the board still asks about you. I smiled politely, though the mention of my husband still left a hollow ache somewhere deep in my chest. Thomas had been gone almost 4 years, but grief did not move in straight lines. Some days it sat quietly beside you like an old companion. Other days it caught you unexpectedly in places filled with music and light and memories you were not prepared to revisit. Around us, conversations resumed carefully. I noticed several people glancing toward Daniel now with polite curiosity. He shifted uncomfortably beside Vanessa, who suddenly seemed very interested in fixing the bracelet on her wrist. Funny how quickly confidence disappears once power changes direction. You remember my son Daniel, I said gently. Margaret's expression brightened immediately. Of course I do. She turned toward him with genuine warmth. My goodness, the last time I saw you, you were running through these hallways stealing dinner rolls from the kitchen. A few nearby guests laughed softly. Daniel forced a smile. It has been a long time. Too long, Margaret replied. Then her eyes moved toward Vanessa. And you must be Daniel's wife. Vanessa straightened immediately, offering the polished smile she used whenever she sensed status nearby. Vanessa Whitmore. It is lovely to finally meet you. Margaret shook her hand politely, but there was something measured in her expression now. Older women notice things younger women think they hide well. Tension, vanity, calculation. We learn to recognize them because we survive long enough to encounter all three. A waiter passed carrying silver trays filled with champagne flutes, and Margaret handed one to me personally before guiding us toward the center of the ballroom. Eleanor practically built half the charitable programs this club still uses today, she announced casually to the small circle gathering around us. When the scholarship fund nearly collapsed in 2008, she was the one who kept it alive. Daniel looked at me sharply. Mom, you never told me any of this. I lowered my eyes briefly toward the glass in my hand. There was never much reason to. And that was true. Mothers spend so many years making sure everyone else feels important that eventually they stop explaining themselves altogether. People grow comfortable receiving sacrifices they never had to witness. Across the ballroom, the jazz pianist shifted into a slower melody, while servers lit candles along the dining tables. Everything glowed softly beneath the chandeliers. Wealth always looks beautiful from far away. Close, it is mostly performance. Margaret leaned toward me slightly. The board still talks about your proposal for the Women's Education Initiative. Vanessa blinked. Women's Education Initiative? She repeated carefully. Eleanor funded scholarships for women returning to college after 60, Margaret explained. It became one of the most successful programs in the state. I saw the exact moment confusion crossed Daniel's face again. Not because of the money, because of the realization that his mother apparently had an entire life he had never cared enough to ask about. Vanessa laughed softly, though it sounded forced now. Well, that is certainly impressive. Certainly impressive. The same woman who had tried to leave me downstairs like an unwanted guest was now speaking to me with careful politeness. Not because her opinion changed. Because the room's opinion had. That is the thing about people obsessed with status. They borrow their values from whoever happens to hold power nearby. Margaret touched my arm gently. The chairman wanted to speak with you privately tonight about the foundation gala next spring. Before I could answer, Daniel finally spoke again. Foundation. His voice sounded smaller now. Less certain. Margaret smiled. The Whitmore Foundation, dear. Your mother has been chairwoman for almost 15 years. Silence settled over our little circle again. This time, nobody looked at me with embarrassment. They looked at Vanessa. Dinner was served shortly after that, but the atmosphere around our table had changed completely. People approached me every few minutes now. Some were old members I had not seen in years. Others were younger couples involved with the scholarship programs. They greeted me warmly, asked about my health, thanked me for donations I barely remembered making. Across the table, Vanessa smiled so hard I thought her jaw might crack. She laughed at conversations half a second too late, and kept smoothing invisible wrinkles from the tablecloth whenever silence threatened to settle near her. Daniel remained unusually quiet. I could feel him watching me between conversations, trying to connect the woman sitting across from him with the version of me he thought he knew. Mothers become invisible slowly. It does not happen all at once. First your children stop asking questions. Then they stop noticing your sacrifices. Eventually they stop imagining you as a person outside the role you serve in their lives. Somewhere along the way, your entire identity gets reduced to birthdays, holiday dinners, and phone calls reminding them to wear coats when it snows. Eleanor practically saved this club after the recession, an older gentleman beside me said while cutting into his filet mignon. Most people here do not even know that. Vanessa nearly dropped her fork. Saved the club, she repeated carefully. The man nodded. The banks were ready to pull funding back in 2008. Her foundation stepped in quietly and covered the operating deficits until membership recovered. Quietly. That word stayed with me. Thomas used to say real generosity rarely announces itself. People who need applause for kindness are usually purchasing attention, not helping others. I glanced toward the enormous windows overlooking the golf course. Outside, the ground shimmered beneath soft garden lights. Thomas loved this view at night. During our early years before Daniel was born, we used to sit near those windows after charity events and dream about the future we wanted to build. Not wealth, stability, a good education for our son, a safe home, opportunities neither of us had growing up. I spent 15 years running Whitmore Bakery while Thomas traveled constantly for work. Every morning I woke up at 4:30 to prepare dough before opening the storefront at 6. I still remember standing in that tiny kitchen during snowstorms with flour covering my hands while Daniel slept in a playpen near the office. There were months I worked 70 hours a week, so we could afford private school tuition after Daniel earned his scholarship placement. He never knew those details. Children rarely do. Vanessa reached for her wine glass carefully. Daniel told me your husband handled most of the family investments. I looked at her calmly. Your father-in-law managed the real estate portfolio, I said softly. The foundation came from the bakery. Daniel stared at me. The bakery? Whitmore Bakery, Margaret interrupted warmly. Half this city grew up eating Eleanor's cinnamon rolls. A few people at nearby tables laughed immediately in recognition. One woman leaned over excitedly. Wait, you are that Eleanor Whitmore? I smiled politely. I suppose so. Vanessa blinked several times. I could almost hear the calculations happening behind her eyes now. The reassessment. The panic. The realization that the quiet older woman she dismissed downstairs had once built something respected long before Vanessa learned how to pose beside luxury handbags on social media. The pianist shifted into a slower tune while candlelight flickered softly across the ballroom. Daniel finally leaned toward me slightly. Why did you never tell me any of this? He asked again. His voice sounded different this time. Less confused. More ashamed. I folded my napkin carefully before answering. Because every time I tried to tell a story about my life, I said quietly, someone changed the subject. Vanessa lowered her eyes immediately. And for the first time all evening, nobody rushed to rescue the silence. After dinner, guests began drifting toward the terrace for cocktails and dessert, but I stayed behind near the ballroom windows for a moment, watching the light spread across the golf course like tiny stars scattered over the dark grass. Somewhere behind me, silverware clinked softly while servers cleared plates with practiced elegance. I used to love evenings like this. Years ago, Thomas and I attended nearly every charity gala at Westbridge together. Back then, Daniel would complain whenever we left him with a babysitter. He would stand in the doorway holding his little blue blanket, asking how late we would be gone. Do not stay out forever, he used to say. Funny how life changes. Children spend years begging you not to leave them, then grow older and slowly stop noticing whether you are there at all. Mom! Daniel's voice startled me slightly. I turned and found him standing alone beside one of the candlelit tables. Vanessa was nowhere nearby. His shoulders looked tense beneath his tuxedo jacket, and for the first time all evening, he looked less like a successful attorney and more like the uncertain little boy who used to follow me around the bakery asking for cinnamon roll scraps. Can we talk? He asked quietly. I nodded once. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. Why did you never tell me about the foundation? About the scholarships? Any of it? I looked at him carefully before answering. Would you have listened? The question landed harder than I intended, because his face tightened immediately. Daniel glanced toward the ballroom entrance where guests laughed softly near the piano. Of course I would have listened. I did not argue. There was no point. Some truths become too obvious to debate. Instead, I folded my gloves slowly over the back of a chair and looked out across the golf course again. Do you remember the summer after your freshman year at Georgetown? I asked. He frowned slightly. A little. You came home worried about tuition. His expression shifted with recognition. Dad said he handled it. Your father helped, I said softly. But the bakery covered most of it that year. Daniel stared at me in silence. I continued before he could interrupt. There were months I worked 6 days a week. During holidays, I barely slept more than 4 hours a night. I used to frost cakes at 2 in the morning while listening for you to come home safely from parties. My voice stayed calm, but memories moved quietly through me now. Flour on my hands before sunrise. Bills stacked beside the coffee machine. Thomas asleep upstairs while I balanced payroll spreadsheets at the kitchen table. Mothers become experts at exhaustion because nobody applauds it when it happens gradually. Daniel rubbed one hand across his face slowly. I did not know. No, I agreed gently. You did not. The ballroom lights reflected faintly against the windows between us. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then his expression darkened slightly. Vanessa should not have treated you that way downstairs. There it was at last. Not quite an apology. More like a legal acknowledgement that something improper had occurred. I almost smiled at the irony. My son had spent 20 years becoming an excellent attorney, while somehow forgetting how to recognize cruelty inside his own marriage. Vanessa likes appearances, I said quietly. She likes being admired. Daniel sighed heavily. She was embarrassed tonight. I turned toward him fully then.
No, y correcta sufli.
She was embarrassed of me long before tonight. His silence confirmed it. Not because he agreed. Because deep down he knew I was right. I thought about every holiday dinner Vanessa quietly rearranged so I sat farther from the guests. She wanted to impress. Every lunch invitation that somehow got lost. Every conversation interrupted the moment I mentioned the bakery, or the old neighborhood where Daniel grew up before success made him uncomfortable with ordinary things. It had never been one cruel moment. That is not how exclusion works. It happens slowly, politely. One small humiliation at a time until a person begins questioning whether they belong anywhere at all. Daniel lowered his eyes toward the floor. I should have noticed, he admitted finally. I looked at my son standing there beneath the soft ballroom lights, older now than Thomas had been when we bought our first tiny storefront bakery, and for the first time in years, I stopped protecting him from the consequences of his own silence. The dessert reception moved onto the terrace shortly after that conversation, and by then the entire mood of the evening had shifted in ways Vanessa could not control anymore. People who barely acknowledged me downstairs were now approaching with warm smiles and familiar stories. One elderly couple thanked me for funding their granddaughter's scholarship 3 years earlier. Another woman squeezed my hand and told me her sister finally finished nursing school at 62 because of one of the grants from the foundation. I listened quietly while soft jazz drifted through the cool night air and servers carried trays of coffee and miniature pastries between the tables. The terrace overlooked the lake behind the golf course, and the water reflected the club lights like scattered pieces of glass. It was beautiful in the kind of understated way old money prefers. No giant displays.
No loud performances.
Just confidence. Vanessa hated that kind of confidence because it could not be bought quickly. I noticed her standing near the bar with 2 women she had spent most of the evening trying to impress. Earlier, they laughed at every story she told. Now their attention kept drifting toward me instead. One of them even walked over to ask about the bakery after hearing Margaret mention it during dinner. Vanessa smiled through the conversation, but her fingers tightened around her wine glass so hard I thought it might crack. I had no idea Eleanor was involved in so much philanthropy, the woman said politely. Vanessa gave a short laugh. Neither did I. There was bitterness hiding underneath the humor now. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Daniel joined me near the terrace railing a few minutes later with 2 cups of coffee in his hands. Still the same? He asked quietly, handing me one the way he used to when I stayed late helping him study during law school finals. Too much cream. Too much sugar. I accepted the cup with a faint smile. Some habits survive. He leaned against the railing beside me, staring out across the lake. Vanessa thinks everyone judged her unfairly tonight. I took a slow sip before answering. Did they? He sighed heavily. Mom. I remained quiet. The thing about getting older is that eventually you stop rushing to soften every truth for other people. Daniel rubbed his jaw tiredly. She did not understand who you were. I looked at him then. No, Daniel. She understood exactly who she thought I was. That silenced him again. A breeze moved softly across the terrace, carrying the scent of roses from the gardens below. Somewhere behind us, guests laughed over glasses of bourbon, while the pianist continued playing inside the ballroom. Everything looked elegant on the surface, but beneath polished manners and expensive suits, people remained exactly who they always were. Kind people became kinder when power shifted. Cruel people simply became quieter. Do you know what hurt the most tonight? I asked softly after a long silence. Daniel looked at me carefully. What? I lowered my eyes toward the coffee cup warming my hands. It was not Vanessa. He frowned slightly. Then what was it? I met his eyes fully for the first time all evening. You watched her try to humiliate me downstairs, I said calmly. And your first instinct was to stay silent because you did not want the evening to become uncomfortable. The words settled between us heavily. Daniel opened his mouth once, then closed it again. There was no defense for that kind of truth. I remembered every moment over the past 5 years when Vanessa dismissed me at family dinners while Daniel changed the subject instead of confronting her. Every holiday where my opinions became interruptions. Every gathering where I slowly transformed from mother into obligation. None of those moments destroyed a relationship alone. But together they built distance, one quiet silence at a time. Daniel stared down at the dark water beyond the terrace. I thought keeping the peace was the right thing to do, he admitted finally. I nodded slowly because I understood that mistake better than he realized. I spent half my life making that same mistake inside my own marriage, inside friendships, inside rooms where women were expected to stay pleasant no matter how invisible they became. Keeping peace and avoiding discomfort are not always the same thing, I said softly. Behind us, I heard Vanessa laugh too loudly at something near the bar, and for the first time that evening, Daniel did not turn around to follow the sound. The evening should have ended there. Quiet conversations, polite smiles, coffee growing cold beneath the terrace lights. But life rarely changes during the loud moments people expect. It changes during the quiet ones afterward, when someone finally sees another person clearly for the first time. Vanessa spent the next hour trying desperately to recover the version of the evening she thought she controlled. I watched her move from table to table with careful elegance, laughing too brightly, touching people lightly on the arm whenever she spoke, performing confidence with the precision of someone who had built her entire identity around appearing admired. But something invisible had shifted around her now. The room no longer responded the same way. Older members who once leaned toward her stories politely excused themselves sooner. Conversations drifted away from her. Attention moved elsewhere. Toward me. Toward Margaret. Toward the foundation gala discussion happening near the terrace fireplace. Status is fragile when it depends entirely on perception. Daniel noticed it too. I could see it in the way his expression tightened whenever Vanessa glanced toward us from across the terrace. At one point she approached our table carrying 2 champagne flutes and offered one to me with a smile that looked painfully rehearsed. I feel terrible about the misunderstanding earlier, she said carefully. I honestly did not realize you were so involved here. So involved here. Not who I was. Not what she said downstairs. Just the consequences. I accepted the glass politely but did not drink from it. That is understandable, I replied softly. Vanessa relaxed slightly, mistaking calmness for forgiveness the way many people do. I hope there are no hard feelings, she continued. Tonight was important for Daniel's career connections. There it was at last. Not apology. Strategy. Everything in Vanessa's world eventually returned to appearances, networking, advancement, positioning. She viewed relationships the same way some people view country clubs. Valuable only if they increase status. Daniel looked embarrassed immediately. Vanessa, he muttered quietly. But she kept going, unable to stop herself now that discomfort had cracked the polished surface she worked so hard to maintain. I mean, people talk at these events, she said with a nervous laugh. You know how social circles can be. I set the untouched champagne flute carefully onto the table beside me. Yes, I said calmly. Ido. Silence followed. The kind that feels heavier because everyone nearby pretends not to notice it. Vanessa shifted awkwardly beneath my gaze for the first time since I met her 6 years ago. Before tonight, she always looked at me with the relaxed confidence of someone certain she held the higher position in the relationship. That certainty was gone now. Margaret approached a moment later carrying a small black folder in her hands. Eleanor, before I forget, she said warmly. The board finalized the scholarship expansion proposal this afternoon. She handed me the folder. We would love your final approval before next month's announcement. Daniel stared at the folder with visible confusion. Scholarship expansion? Margaret smiled proudly. Your mother is funding a national initiative for women over 60 returning to college after widowhood or financial hardship. Vanessa blinked hard. National. Margaret nodded. 27 states so far. The terrace suddenly felt very still around us. I opened the folder quietly while candlelight flickered across the pages. Numbers. Program locations. Partnerships with universities. Plans I had spent nearly 2 years building quietly after Thomas died because grief leaves empty spaces inside people. And I discovered the only thing that helped fill mine was helping women who believed life had already ended for them. Daniel looked at me like a stranger now. Not coldly. Almost reverently. As though he was trying to understand how the woman he reduced to holiday dinners and polite phone calls had somehow continued building entire worlds while he stopped paying attention. Vanessa lowered her eyes toward the tablecloth. I had no idea, she whispered softly. I believed her this time. Because people like Vanessa never imagine older women still possess power unless that power announces itself loudly. They mistake softness for weakness, silence for irrelevance, age for disappearance. I closed the folder gently and looked toward the lake shimmering beneath the terrace lights. Most people do not notice women like me, I said quietly, until they suddenly need something from us. No one at the table disagreed. By 10 o'clock the crowd on the terrace had begun thinning out, leaving behind half-empty champagne glasses, fading jazz music, and the quiet exhaustion that settles over expensive events once everyone finishes performing for each other. I stood near the staircase gathering my gloves and handbag when Margaret touched my arm gently. Before you leave, she said softly, there is something the board wanted to discuss privately. I followed her into one of the smaller conference rooms overlooking the lake. The room smelled faintly of polished wood and old books. Framed photographs of past board chairmen lined the walls, almost all of them men in dark suits with confident smiles. Margaret closed the door quietly behind us. 2 other board members sat near the long mahogany table waiting for us. Daniel and Vanessa remained outside on the terrace. For the first time all evening I was grateful for that. Eleanor, one of the board members, began carefully, sliding a folder toward me. The expansion project has attracted national attention faster than we anticipated. I opened the folder slowly. Newspaper coverage, university partnerships, donation projections. The foundation I built quietly after Thomas died had become larger than I ever intended, larger than my grief. Several major donors are prepared to contribute, Margaret explained. But there is one condition. I looked up calmly. What condition? She hesitated briefly before answering. They want the Whitmore Foundation attached publicly to the Westbridge Legacy Initiative. I almost laughed softly at the irony. The same institution where my daughter-in-law tried to remove me less than 3 hours earlier now wanted my name displayed permanently across their largest philanthropic campaign. Life has a strange sense of timing sometimes. You do not have to decide tonight, Margaret added gently. I closed the folder and rested one hand against the polished table. Actually, I said quietly, I think I already have. The room fell silent. I spent most of my life building things quietly, I continued. Businesses, scholarships, stability for my family. I never needed recognition for any of it. I paused briefly, thinking of Thomas, of the bakery, of mornings before sunrise while Daniel slept upstairs completely unaware of how hard his parents worked to give him opportunities neither of us had growing up. But recently, I said softly, I realized something dangerous happens when women spend too many years making themselves invisible for the comfort of others. Margaret's eyes softened immediately. She understood. Women our age usually do. I signed the approval papers slowly while the lake shimmered outside the windows beneath the dark night sky.
No dramatic speeches. No triumphant moment.
Just a pen moving quietly across paper, while something inside me settled into place for the first time in years. When I stepped back onto the terrace 20 minutes later, Daniel looked up immediately. Vanessa stood beside him near the railing, unusually quiet now. The board members followed behind me, still discussing logistics for the spring launch event. One of them stopped beside Daniel and shook his hand warmly. Your mother is extraordinary, he said sincerely before walking away. Daniel watched me differently after that. Not as an obligation, not as background, as a person. It should not have taken public validation from wealthy strangers for my son to finally see me clearly, but sometimes people only recognize value once the world around them confirms it first. Vanessa folded her arms lightly against the cool night air. So the foundation is becoming national? She asked carefully. I nodded once. It appears that way. She forced a small smile. That is incredible. I looked at her quietly for a few seconds before answering. It was already incredible before tonight. Her expression tightened slightly because she understood exactly what I meant. Daniel stepped closer then, his voice lower now. Mom, maybe we should have dinner next week. Just us. Just us. I almost smiled at how quickly people reach for intimacy once they fear losing access to someone. But exhaustion had settled deeply into my bones by then. Not physical exhaustion. Something older. The kind that comes from finally recognizing how long you accepted being treated like less than you were. I adjusted my gloves slowly and glanced toward the terrace exit where the security guard still stood near the staircase. I think I am ready to go home, I said softly. The terrace had grown quieter by the time I finally made my way toward the exit. Most of the guests were leaving now, their voices fading into the warm spring night while valets pulled luxury cars beneath the covered entrance one after another. The jazz music inside the ballroom had stopped completely. Only the soft sound of silverware being cleared remained somewhere in the distance. I walked slowly through the marble hallway with my gloves folded neatly over my handbag, feeling strangely calm. Not triumphant. Not angry. Just awake in a way I had not felt for years. Daniel followed a few steps behind me while Vanessa remained near the terrace doors speaking quietly with another couple. Or pretending to. Every few seconds her eyes drifted toward us. I could feel it without turning around. The security guard near the front entrance straightened the moment he saw me approaching. "Good evening again, Mrs. Whitmore," he said warmly as he opened the heavy glass door for me. "Drive safely tonight." I smiled gently. "Thank you, Mr. Carter." Daniel looked surprised. "You know his name?" Mr. Carter chuckled softly before I could answer. "Your mother remembers everybody's name," he said. "That is why people respect her around here." Such a small sentence. Yet it landed harder than all the speeches and compliments from earlier. Respect has very little to do with money. People learn that too late. I stepped outside beneath the covered entrance where cool air carried the scent of rain from somewhere nearby. My car waited near the curb under the soft yellow lights. Thomas bought that car for me 8 years ago after the bakery celebrated its 30th anniversary. Nothing flashy. Just reliable. Comfortable. Built to last. Like most things we valued. Daniel stopped beside me, slipping both hands into his coat pockets the same way he did when he was nervous as a teenager. "Mom," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology." I looked at him carefully but did not rush to rescue him from the discomfort this time. He swallowed hard before continuing. "Not just for tonight. For a lot of things." Behind us, the ballroom doors opened briefly as laughter spilled into the night air before fading again. Daniel glanced down at the pavement. "I think somewhere along the way, I started seeing you only as my mother." I almost smiled sadly at that. "I was always your mother." "I know," he replied quickly. "But I stopped seeing everything else." The honesty in his voice softened something inside me then, though not enough to erase the years between us. Healing does not happen in one emotional conversation beneath expensive lights. Real damage settles slowly into relationships. So does repair. I adjusted my coat sleeve quietly. "Your father used to worry about that," I admitted softly. Daniel frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "He used to say success can make people forget where love came from." Daniel lowered his eyes immediately because he understood exactly what I meant. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he looked toward the ballroom entrance where Vanessa still stood talking stiffly beside the terrace doors. "She feels awful," he said carefully. I followed his gaze briefly before answering. "No," I said calmly. "She feels embarrassed." He started to object, then stopped himself. Deep down he knew that truth too. I opened the car door slowly before turning back toward him one last time. "Daniel," I said gently, "there is something important you should understand." He looked at me immediately. "Tonight did not hurt because your wife underestimated me." I paused briefly. "It hurt because you allowed her to." His expression collapsed quietly then.
No anger. No defensiveness.
Just the painful realization that silence carries consequences too. I touched his arm softly before getting into the car. Not to comfort him. Just to let him know I still loved him despite everything. Mothers are strange that way. We carry heartbreak and love in the same hand for years without dropping either one. As I pulled away from Westbridge Country Club, I glanced once in the rearview mirror. Daniel still stood beneath the entrance lights alone, hands in his pockets, watching my car disappear into the night. And for the first time in many years, I realized I no longer needed anyone in that building to remind me who I was.